I am Joshua, 32, and my own brother sabotaged my car and left me to die at the bottom of a ravine. Before I tell you about how I sent him to maximum security prison and took back my family's entire legacy, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The heavy Oregon fog was thick that evening on the Devil's Backbone. If you have ever driven through the Pacific Northwest during the late fall, you know exactly the kind of weather I am talking about. It is a creeping, suffocating mist that rolls off the ocean and swallows the coastal highways whole. The Devil's Backbone is a notoriously treacherous stretch of road. It weaves dangerously close to the jagged cliffs, with nothing but a rusted metal guardrail separating the asphalt from a 200-foot drop into a rocky ravine. It is the kind of road that demands your absolute, undivided attention. You don't play with the radio. You don't look at your phone. You just grip the wheel and pray the headlights cut through the gray soup ahead of you. I was driving my silver sedan, keeping my speed a cautious 10 miles under the limit. My hands were firmly planted at 10 and 2. The tires hummed a steady, rhythmic song against the damp pavement. Everything felt completely normal. I had driven this route 100 times before to check on the family estate. I approached the sharpest curve on the cliffside, a notorious hairpin turn locals called the Widowmaker. I eased my foot off the gas pedal and began to turn the steering wheel to the left to navigate the severe bend. But nothing happened. The steering column was completely dead. It didn't jam. It didn't resist. It just spun freely in my hands, completely disconnected from the front axle. It felt like turning a plastic wheel on a child's arcade game. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked directly in the center of my chest. I slammed my foot on the brake pedal, pressing it all the way to the floorboard, but the momentum of the heavy car on the slick, downward slope was simply too much. The rusted metal guardrail rushed toward my windshield at terrifying speed. I barely had time to brace myself before the impact. The sound of tearing steel and shattering glass was absolutely deafening. My sedan tore through the barrier like it was made of paper. The front wheels left the solid ground, and my stomach plummeted into my shoes as the car launched into the empty, white abyss of the ravine. Gravity took total control. The world outside my windows spun in a violent, chaotic blur of gray rocks, green pine needles, and terrifying weightlessness. The car slammed into the side of the cliff, the force of the impact throwing me violently against the seatbelt. We flipped once, twice, the metal roof caving in closer and closer to my head with every brutal roll. Finally, with a sickening crunch of collapsing metal, the car came to a crushing halt deep in the dense brush at the bottom of the canyon. The silence that followed the crash was heavier and more terrifying than the noise. I was suspended completely upside down. The seatbelt was cutting into my collarbone like a garrote wire, making it nearly impossible to draw a full breath. Blood dripped steadily from a deep gash on my forehead, pooling onto the cracked, shattered glass of the interior roof below me. I could smell the sharp, metallic tang of my own blood mixing with the heavy, toxic odor of leaking gasoline. The engine was hissing. Every single breath I took felt like inhaling crushed glass. My left arm was pinned beneath the crushed door panel, and my legs felt entirely numb. I forced my heavy, blood-crusted eyelids open. Through the shattered remains of the passenger window, I looked up toward the jagged edge of the cliff far above me. The fog shifted in the wind, parting just enough to reveal a silhouette. It was a man standing at the very edge of the broken guardrail, looking down into the ravine. Behind him, the sleek, unmistakable LED headlights of a black Porsche SUV cut through the mist. I knew that car. I had seen the monthly lease payments for it. I knew the tailored, expensive wool coat the man was wearing. It was my older brother, Christopher. My vision blurred, but my mind was desperately, frantically trying to process what my eyes were seeing. He was there. He had been following me. I tried to shout his name, tried to beg for him to call 911, but my vocal cords completely refused to work. Only a weak, wet gasp escaped my lips, barely louder than the hissing engine. I waited for him to pull his cell phone out of his pocket. I waited for him to scramble down the dangerous rocks, to scream for help, to do what any human being, let alone a brother, would do in a tragedy. Christopher didn't reach for his phone. He didn't yell out my name. He stood perfectly still on the edge of the cliff. He casually adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, pulled back his coat, and checked the time on his expensive Rolex watch. Then he took one last, long look down into the ravine. Even from that distance, I could feel the absolute emptiness in his stare. His face was entirely devoid of horror, grief, or shock. He looked like a businessman checking off a completed task on a clipboard. He turned his back on me, walked slowly back to his Porsche, and opened the door. The heavy, solid thud of his car door echoing down the canyon was the last sound I heard before his engine roared to life. The red tail lights slowly faded into the thick fog. He left me down there in the twisted metal to rot. The darkness finally pulled me under, and I passed out. Waking up was a slow, agonizing intrusion. The earthy scent of pine trees and raw gasoline was gone, replaced by the harsh, sterile smell of bleach, rubbing alcohol, and hospital linens. A rhythmic, piercing beeping sound drilled directly into my skull. I tried to open my eyes, but the fluorescent lights overhead flickered intensely, sending sharp, blinding spikes of pain through my temples. I tried to move my right arm, but a tangled web of 4 lines tethered me to the hospital bed. A young nurse with kind but deeply tired eyes noticed I was stirring. She rushed over, her hands gently but quickly checking my vitals on the monitors. She introduced herself as Sarah. She told me my name, told me I was in the intensive care unit of a small coastal hospital, and explained the miracle of how I was even breathing. She said a passing motorist named Aaron, a truck driver on his midnight route, had spotted the fresh tire tracks and the broken guardrail. He had climbed down the dangerous ravine with a flashlight and a crowbar, pulling me out of the wreckage just minutes before the leaking gas line ignited and the engine block caught fire. My throat was as dry as sandpaper. Swallowing felt like choking on thorns. I managed to croak out a single, desperate question. My family, where are they? Nurse Sarah's eyes immediately dropped to the linoleum floor. She shifted her weight uncomfortably, her hands smoothing out my thin hospital blanket a little too aggressively. She told me I had been unconscious in this bed for 5 entire days. And then she dropped the bombshell. She said a man perfectly matching my brother's description, wearing a designer coat and carrying himself with an air of profound arrogance, had walked into the lobby just yesterday afternoon. He didn't ask to see me. He didn't ask the doctors about my condition. He didn't ask if I had brain damage or if I would ever be able to walk again. He simply tossed my recovered, blood-stained leather wallet onto the reception desk, loudly claimed he was late for an international flight, and walked out the automatic doors. He didn't sign a single medical release form. He didn't provide an insurance card. He left no emergency contact number. He was treating my impending death not as a tragedy, but as a minor administrative inconvenience he had already moved past. I lay there staring at the perforated ceiling tiles, the physical agony in my broken ribs suddenly overshadowed by a freezing, absolute clarity settling deep into my bones. The hospital room was suffocatingly quiet after Nurse Sarah left to check on another patient. The silence was a curse. It gave me way too much time to think, too much time to lay there and replay the last 32 years of my life like a tragic movie I was forced to watch. For as long as I could remember, I had been the absolute ghost in my own family. Christopher was the golden child. He was the sun, and the rest of us were just planets forced to orbit around his brilliance. He was the one with the natural charisma, the towering shelves of athletic trophies, the booming, infectious laugh that commanded the attention of every room he ever walked into. Our parents, Robert and Martha, absolutely adored him to a fault. They poured every single ounce of their energy, their affection, and their considerable wealth into securing his future. They viewed him as the ultimate legacy of the family name. Whenever there was a choice to be made, Christopher won. I vividly remembered the day I got my acceptance letter to a prestigious out-of-state university. I was ecstatic, but that very same week, Christopher had managed to blow through his entire college fund. He had spent it partying across Europe, renting yachts he couldn't afford and buying rounds of drinks for strangers. When the bill came due, my parents didn't reprimand him. They didn't make him get a job. They simply, quietly mortgaged their beautiful summer home on the lake to cover his massive debts. When I asked about my tuition, my father patted me on the shoulder and said, "Joshua, you're the smart one. You'll figure it out. Your brother needs our help right now." So I figured it out. I worked 3 different minimum wage jobs just to pay for my local state university tuition. I stocked shelves at a grocery store at 4 a.m., attended classes all day, and waited tables at night. I never complained. Not once. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I proved myself to be the responsible, steady, reliable son, they would eventually see my value. I thought my silent sacrifices would earn their love. At our parents' funeral 3 years ago, a horrific double pneumonia that took them both within weeks of each other, Christopher stood at the Grand Oak podium. He delivered a tearful, charismatic, beautifully written eulogy that left the entire packed church weeping into their tissues. He spoke about family bonds and honoring their memory. But I knew the truth. Behind closed doors, in the dim light of the church rectory, not even an hour after they were lowered into the ground, he was already aggressively cornering the estate lawyer, demanding to know exactly how quickly the liquid assets could be transferred into his personal accounts. I was the one who actually stepped up to manage the heavy burden of the family's legacy. Our parents had spent 4 decades obsessively building an archive of rare, historical manuscripts and first-edition books. The collection was appraised at nearly $30 million. It was an intricate, highly demanding operation. The texts required specific climate controls, constant security, and meticulous cataloging. To ensure the collection wasn't broken up and sold for scraps, I made the hardest decision of my life. I gave up a 6-figure salary at one of the top accounting firms in the country. I turned down a massive promotion that would have made me a junior partner. I sacrificed my own career trajectory to ensure the massive property taxes were paid on time and the preservation trust was properly managed. I was the silent, invisible engine keeping the entire family machine running. Christopher, on the other hand, was an absolute financial black hole. His personal life was a string of spectacular, expensive disasters. After his second incredibly messy divorce, which culminated in a brutal, highly publicized custody battle where he rightfully lost all access to his own kids because of his reckless behavior, his life spiraled completely out of control. To save face in his elite social circles, he opened a high-end, pretentious boutique art gallery downtown. It failed spectacularly within 12 months. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to aggressive offshore bookies. He drove a leased Porsche SUV he couldn't afford to put gas in, and he wore bespoke Italian suits bought on maxed-out, high-interest credit cards. He lived entirely on the fragile illusion of extreme wealth. And that illusion was funded entirely by the steady interest generated by my grueling, daily hard work managing the trust. Now, lying broken in this hospital bed, staring at the 4 drips slowly feeding fluids into my bruised arm, the final horrifying piece of the puzzle snapped into place. I wasn't just a younger brother to Christopher. I wasn't family. I was the absolute last remaining obstacle standing between him and total, unchecked control of the family fortune. My loyalty, my quiet dedication had been my fatal flaw. He didn't just casually abandon me on that foggy cliff by accident. He followed me. He orchestrated the mechanical failure. He went out to the Devil's Backbone that night to look down into the ravine and make absolutely sure the job was done. The heavy dose of intravenous pain medication made me feel sluggish and groggy, but my mind had never been sharper or more focused in my entire life. I gripped the cold metal bed rails with both hands and slowly, painfully forced myself to sit up. My crushed ribs screamed in agonizing protest, sending hot flares of pain through my chest, but I completely ignored it. I looked down at my bruised, battered, scraped hands. I had spent my entire adult life taking the heavy hits so Christopher could stand in the spotlight and shine. I had suffered from a deep, ingrained psychological condition, a learned helplessness that convinced me my only role in this world was to support him, never to lead. But that pathetic, subservient version of Joshua died in the twisted, bloody wreckage at the bottom of the canyon. The man sitting up in this hospital bed was someone entirely different. I wasn't a victim crying over a broken family anymore. I was a forensic auditor. I was an executioner of justice. And my brother's carefully constructed, fraudulent life was about to be aggressively dismantled and drained to zero. I immediately closed my eyes and let my head loll to the side when I heard the distinct, heavy sound of leather dress shoes echoing in the hallway outside my room. I forced my muscles to relax. I regulated my breathing, keeping the rise and fall of my chest slow and shallow, mimicking the deep sleep of a comatose patient. I needed to hear exactly what Christopher would say when he thought his prey was completely incapacitated and no one important was listening. The footsteps stopped right at the nurse's station, located just a few feet outside my open door. His voice drifted in, pitched perfectly at that specific frequency of performative, brave grief he had mastered over the years. He was speaking to Nurse Sarah. "Excuse me, miss," Christopher said, his tone dripping with thick, fake sorrow. "Has my poor, dear younger brother shown any signs of discharge yet? The doctors in the ER told me the brain trauma was incredibly severe. They said he might never wake up. I just need to know if I should start making the permanent arrangements. The funeral preparations. It's tearing me apart to see him like this." My jaw clenched so hard under the thin hospital blanket that I thought my teeth might actually crack. Brain trauma. He was already laying the legal groundwork to have me declared permanently mentally incapacitated. If he convinced the doctors I was a vegetable, he could easily secure emergency medical power of attorney. He would have the legal right to pull my life support and drain the accounts before my body was even cold. I waited until I heard him thank the nurse, his footsteps quickly fading down the long linoleum hallway toward the elevator bank. As soon as the coast was entirely clear, I hit the red call button taped to my bed rail. Nurse Sarah walked in a moment later, her expression guarded and deeply sympathetic. She walked over to check my bag. I didn't beat around the bush. I didn't play the weak patient. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice raspy but entirely steady. "Sarah, I need to borrow your personal tablet or smartphone for exactly 5 minutes. I know it's against hospital policy, but I swear to you, my life literally depends on it." She froze. She looked at my bruised, stitched face, then glanced nervously toward the open door. She hesitated for a long, agonizing second. Then, without saying a word, she reached into the deep pocket of her blue scrubs, silently pulled out her iPad mini, unlocked it, and handed it directly to me. My fingers flew across the smooth glass screen with frantic precision. I opened the web browser and navigated straight to the highly secure, private portal of our family's inheritance trust fund. I typed in my complex administrator password. The dashboard loaded, and the pending notifications hit me like a physical punch to the gut. But my heart rate on the monitor next to me didn't even spike. I felt a cold, terrifyingly clinical detachment taking over my brain. There, blinking in bright red text, were 3 separate, highly expedited requests to totally liquidate the $15 million inheritance trust. All 3 requests had been formally filed online at 11:45 p.m., mere hours after my car had plummeted into the ravine. He wasn't waiting for the hospital to call a time of death. He was actively cashing out my life. He was liquidating a generation of my parents' wealth to immediately cover his offshore gambling debts and the impending eviction notice on his failed art gallery. But as I scrolled down the digital ledger, my blood ran completely cold. There was a secondary digital signature authorizing the massive transfer requests. It belonged to Carter. Carter was the senior managing partner at the elite wealth management firm handling our family trust. I had trusted Carter implicitly for over a decade. We had played golf together. I had been to his daughter's wedding. Seeing his digital authorization on these blatantly fraudulent transfers was a bitter, sickening pill to swallow. Christopher had obviously promised Carter a massive, illegal cut of the $15 million to bypass the standard security protocols and push the money through the system. I didn't waste precious time feeling betrayed or crying over lost friendships. I opened an encrypted messaging application I used for secure financial communications and rapidly typed out 2 vital text messages. The very first message went to Elijah, our family's fiercely loyal, longtime legal counsel. He was a bulldog in a courtroom and the only man my parents trusted more than me. The message was concise. Elijah, I am alive. Christopher sabotaged my car and tried to kill me. File an emergency ex parte injunction to freeze all trust assets and the manuscript collection immediately. Carter at the firm is heavily compromised. Trust no one but me. The second message went to my absolute best friend, Matthew. Matthew was a former military contractor who now ran a private security firm. Matt, I'm trapped at St. Jude Coastal Hospital. Room 402. Bring dark clothes and a burner phone. Park your truck at the rear loading dock by the laundry exit. I need to completely disappear tonight. When Sarah came back into the room to retrieve her tablet, I deleted the browser history, handed it back to her, and looked her in the eye. Sarah, I need a massive favor. One that requires you to look the other way and completely forget I was ever in this bed. She looked at the heart monitors, looked at the door, and then looked back at me. She nodded slowly. She understood the gravity of the situation without me having to say another word. By midnight, I had ripped the 4 out of my arm, taping a piece of gauze over the bleeding vein. I was out of the humiliating hospital gown and dressed in the dark sweatpants, black hoodie, and baseball cap Matthew had smuggled in through the fire stairs. Under the cover of darkness, aided by a local county sheriff, Matthew had contacted who owed his security firm a massive favor. I walked out of the service elevator and into the freezing coastal night. To the hospital administration records, I was a confused patient who had wandered off. To the outside world, I was a missing person presumed dead. But to the local authorities, I was officially entering protective custody as a star witness. I evaporated into the Oregon fog, ready to aggressively dismantle my brother's life piece by piece. The safe house Matthew secured was an old, weather-beaten hunting cabin located miles away from the city limits, deep in the dense Oregon pine forests. It was entirely off the grid. It smelled of damp, rotting wood, old dust, and cold ashes in the fireplace. But with its heavy steel doors and secluded location, it was the absolute perfect command center for an audit of vengeance. Sitting at the heavily scratched, worn kitchen table, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of Matthew's high-end tactical laptop, I watched my brother confidently execute his hostile takeover. Months ago, suspecting Christopher might try to sneak into the house to steal smaller artifacts, I had personally installed hidden, high-definition security cameras in the family mansion's grand library. I told everyone they were just motion sensors to monitor the delicate climate control system for the rare manuscripts. Now, those hidden lenses gave me a front-row, 4K resolution seat to Christopher's illegal auction. The laptop screen displayed the grand library, completely transformed into a makeshift, high-end showroom. Christopher was wearing a pristine, custom-tailored tuxedo, holding a crystal glass of scotch. He was smoothly mingling with a dozen of the city's wealthiest, most predatory private investors and black market collectors. He was wearing a mask of tragic, heavy burden, playing the role of the grieving brother tasked with an impossible burden. I cranked up the audio feed. I watched as he handed out thick folders containing forged medical documents to the men in the room. He whispered, his voice cracking with fake emotion, that his poor brother Joshua was practically brain-dead on life support. He spun a brilliant, desperate lie, claiming that he needed to quietly and quickly liquidate the $30 million manuscript collection to cover astronomical, out-of-pocket medical bills and to secure the estate from aggressive creditors. He was offering these sharks a massive, once-in-a-lifetime discount for immediate cash purchases. He claimed that, as my emergency medical guardian, he had the legal authority to completely bypass the usual lengthy probate laws. It was a masterful performance. It was desperate, brilliant, and entirely unequivocally illegal. He really thought he was the new king of the castle, but I saw right through the expensive silk and the imported scotch. He was just a scavenger, frantically burning the antique furniture just to keep the house warm for one more night. But stopping the auction and freezing the trust wasn't enough. Financial fraud would only get him a few years in a white-collar resort prison. I wanted him in a maximum security cell. I needed the undeniable, physical proof of his violent attempt on my life. "The car," I said suddenly, breaking the heavy silence in the dark cabin. I slammed my hand on the table. "Matthew, where exactly did the state police tow my car after they pulled it out of the ravine?" Matthew didn't ask questions. His fingers typed furiously across his encrypted database access. The main police impound lot in the city was completely full because of a massive highway pileup that weekend. They outsourced the overflow. They towed your sedan to a private, unlicensed scrap yard on the deep industrial edge of town. It's owned by a guy with a rap sheet named Julian. I stood up, grabbing my heavy winter coat off the back of the chair. "Christopher is arrogant, but he isn't stupid. He won't leave that car intact for the state insurance investigators to find. He'll pay Julian under the table in cash to crush that sedan into a cube of scrap metal before dawn." We arrived at Julian's junkyard just after 2 a.m. The coastal air was freezing, biting violently through my clothes and making my broken, bruised ribs ache with every single shallow breath I took. The scrap yard was a sprawling, terrifying maze of rusted, twisted metal and towering, unstable stacks of crushed vehicles. A massive, industrial hydraulic crusher sat directly in the center of the dirt lot, humming with a low, menacing standby power. Julian was clearly planning to run the machine before the sun came up and the city woke up. We moved silently through the dark shadows, our heavy boots crunching softly on the loose gravel, discarded spark plugs, and broken safety glass. We found my silver sedan tucked far away in a dark, muddy corner of the lot. It looked like a crumpled, discarded piece of tin foil. The entire front end was completely mangled, the hood folded entirely in half. I didn't hesitate. I dropped straight down to my knees in the freezing, oily dirt, completely ignoring the sharp, blinding protest from the stitches in my scalp and the agony in my chest. I slid on my back under the crushed front chassis, the smell of burnt rubber and old grease filling my nose. Matthew crouched beside the car, clicking on a high-powered tactical flashlight. He aimed the blinding white beam directly at the exposed front axle and the steering linkage. I wasn't looking for a standard mechanical failure. I wasn't looking for rust or wear and tear. I was looking for a signature. And right there, illuminated in the stark white light, tucked deep behind the shattered wheel well, I found it. The heavy steel steering linkage had not snapped randomly from the violent force of the plunge. It had a clean, perfectly straight, microscopic incision. A laser precision cut. It was a surgical alteration, intentionally engineered to leave just enough of the metal intact so I could safely back out of my driveway and merge onto the highway. But it was mathematically calculated to fail completely and snap under the maximum torque applied when taking the sharpest curve of the devil's backbone. "Matthew, pull out your camera. Record this right now," I whispered, my voice as cold and hard as the steel hovering inches above my face. "Get every angle. Get it in 4K resolution." This was not a tragic accident. It was a premeditated, calculated execution. Suddenly, a memory hit me. Christopher had stood in my kitchen just 4 days before the crash, insisting that my car needed a comprehensive tune-up. He had enthusiastically recommended a specialist mechanic he knew downtown who owed him a favor. That mechanic must have been Julian. My own brother had traded my life to cover his boutique gallery lease and a few more months of pretending to be a high society elite. As Matthew filmed the undeniable metallic proof of my attempted murder, I realized Christopher had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to totally destroy him. The annual Historical Heritage fundraising gala at the Grand Hotel was the absolute crown jewel of the city's high society calendar. It was a dazzling, suffocating sea of false white-toothed smiles, incredibly expensive silk gowns, and the heavy, intoxicating scent of borrowed power and old money. Christopher was standing right at the center of the grand ballroom, holding court under a massive crystal chandelier. He looked absolutely immaculate in a bespoke crimson velvet dinner jacket, playing the role of the tragic, grieving guardian to absolute perfection. I stood completely still in the heavy shadows of the thick velvet curtains near the rear service exit. I was flanked by Matthew on my left and two stern-faced, plainclothes detectives from the Major Crimes Unit on my right. Elijah, my lawyer, was already positioned by the audiovisual tech booth at the back of the room. Through the crowd, I watched Christopher strategically approach Nathan. Nathan was a notoriously ruthless billionaire private investor. He was the kind of man who drove a custom Phantom Rolls-Royce and made his fortune snapping up distressed family assets for pennies on the dollar. Christopher leaned in close, whispering desperately into Nathan's ear. He was undoubtedly offering him a highly illegal backdoor cash deal on our parents' most valuable one-of-a-kind first edition journals. It was finally time to foreclose on my brother's fraudulent life. I stepped out from the shadows of the curtains. I didn't rush. I didn't run. I walked slowly, deliberately, straight down the center aisle of the marble ballroom floor. I was wearing a sharp, dark-tailored suit, but I hadn't removed the thick white medical bandage wrapped tightly around my forehead. It was a stark, jarring visual indictment of his treachery. The low hum of classical music and wealthy chatter in the room began to die down, rippling outward from me like a wave until the entire ballroom fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. It was the kind of heavy silence that usually precedes a judge reading a final, devastating verdict. Christopher stopped talking to Nathan and turned around. For a fraction of a second, the charismatic, confident mask totally slipped, and I saw pure, unadulterated primal terror flash in his eyes. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped right through his manicured fingers and shattered violently on the polished marble floor. The sharp sound echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. He didn't run to embrace me. He didn't drop to his knees and cry tears of joyous relief that his brother was miraculously alive. Instead, his vicious survival instinct immediately kicked in, and he doubled down on the massive lie that had become his only currency. "Security!" Christopher screamed, his voice pitching high, shrill, and panicked. He pointed a violently trembling finger directly at my chest. "Security! Get him out of here right now. My brother is having a severe psychotic break. He walked out of the locked psychiatric ward. He's violent and dangerous to everyone here." Before the hired hotel guards in the corner could even take a single step toward me, Elijah gave a sharp, definitive nod to the tech booth. Under the strict authority of a court-ordered wiretap we had legally secured through the detectives that very morning, the massive ballroom speakers suddenly cracked to life. Christopher's own voice boomed through the high-definition sound system, echoing off the gold leaf ceilings. It was a crystal-clear recording from a burner phone conversation he had frantically made just hours earlier. "Listen to me, Julian. Give me 2 more days. The idiot isn't dead yet, he's just lying in a bed. But I will forge his signature on the trust documents tonight. You just tell your guys to make sure that wrecked silver sedan is in the hydraulic crusher by morning. Crush it into a cube. No one can ever find the cut on that steering column. Do you understand me? Crush it." The massive weight of those recorded words slammed into the elegant crowd like a physical shockwave. Nathan, the billionaire investor in the bespoke suit, physically took a large step backward away from Christopher, violently brushing his own suit jacket as if my brother's proximity was a highly contagious, deadly disease. The surrounding elite socialites, the people Christopher had spent years trying to impress, stared at him in absolute, disgusted horror. Christopher scrambled backward, his face completely pale and sweating profusely, his crimson jacket suddenly looking ridiculous. "That's fake. That's an AI audio deepfake. He's trying to steal my money. I have official medical records proving his severe brain damage. I am his sole legal guardian." That was exactly when the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open again. Nurse Sarah walked in. She was wearing her standard blue hospital scrubs, looking entirely, wonderfully out of place in the sea of tuxedos and gowns, but carrying more moral authority than anyone else in that room. She walked right up to the center of the stunned crowd, looked Christopher directly in his terrified eyes, and delivered the killing blow. "Joshua was never your patient, Christopher," Sarah said, her voice ringing clear, steady, and loud across the absolutely silent room. "He hasn't been a standard hospital patient for days. He has been a cooperating police witness under state protection since the second he opened his eyes. Christopher's legs completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily to his knees right there on the cold marble floor, his expensive pants soaking up the spilled champagne. The two plainclothes detectives stepped forward, grabbing his arms roughly and wrenching them behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of police handcuffs securely locking around his wrists echoed in the quiet room. He looked up at me from the floor, his eyes wide, pathetic, and pleading for mercy. But I looked down at the man who shared my blood and felt absolutely nothing. The ledger was finally permanently balanced. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please help me like the video and leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you've been with me this far. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. The immediate aftermath of the gala confrontation was incredibly swift, utterly brutal, and deeply satisfying to watch. The elaborate, expensive illusion that Christopher had spent his entire adult life desperately building evaporated entirely in the span of 30 seconds. As the uniformed police officers marched him roughly out through the Grand Hotel lobby, the very same wealthy socialites who had been offering him their deepest condolences and opening their massive checkbooks just minutes earlier literally turned their backs on him. He wasn't just broke, he was a social pariah. He was toxic waste. But the dominoes were just beginning to fall. Within the hour, the state authorities executed a series of highly synchronized, aggressive arrest warrants. Carter, the corrupt trust manager who had illegally authorized the massive $15 million transfers to Christopher's accounts, was pulled aggressively out of his sprawling suburban McMansion in handcuffs, while his neighbors watched from their lawns. The State Financial Crimes Division, tipped off by my lawyer Elijah, had already successfully traced the massive bribe money directly from Christopher's accounts into Carter's hidden offshore shell companies. Carter's prestigious career in wealth management was over, replaced by a guaranteed federal prison sentence. Simultaneously across town, a heavily armed police tactical unit raided the industrial junkyard. They arrested Julian just as he was desperately firing up the massive hydraulic crusher, frantically trying to destroy my silver sedan before the sun came up. But Julian wasn't a loyal soldier willing to go down with the ship. He was a survivor. The absolute second the homicide detectives sat him down in the interrogation room and showed him the high-resolution photos Matthew had taken of the laser-cut steering column, Julian totally cracked. To secure a lighter sentence for himself, he immediately handed over a hidden thumb drive. It contained his own secret, crystal-clear audio recordings of Christopher explicitly threatening his life if he didn't do the sabotage job. Julian had kept the digital receipts to protect himself, and those recordings became the final, undeniable nail in my brother's legal coffin. Later that same night, long after the adrenaline had faded into a deep, bone-aching exhaustion, I sat quietly in the dark observation room at the downtown police precinct. Through the thick, two-way mirror glass, I watched Christopher sitting alone at the cold metal interrogation table. He looked incredibly small, pathetic, and entirely stripped of his tailored suits and his towering arrogance. He was wearing an oversized Orange County Jail jumpsuit. Detective Wyatt, the lead investigator on the case, opened the heavy door and gestured silently for me to step inside. I took a deep breath, walked into the harsh, buzzing fluorescent light of the interrogation room, and sat down in the metal chair directly across from the man I used to call my older brother. Christopher immediately leaned forward, the heavy steel chains of his shackles clinking loudly against the table. "Josh," he whispered, his voice violently trembling, desperately trying to summon the old, boyish charm that had gotten him out of trouble with our parents for 30 years. "Josh, please, you have to listen to me. We're family. We're blood. You know me. I was in so much debt. I was completely desperate. The offshore bookies were threatening my life. They said they would kill me. I didn't actually want to hurt you, I just panicked. I made a terrible mistake. You have to talk to the DA. Tell them to drop the attempted murder charges. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. I'm your brother, Josh. I sat perfectly still and just stared at him for a long time. I looked at his shaking hands, the exact same hands that had casually handed over a stack of cash to a mechanic to cut my steering wheel. I looked deeply into the eyes that had coldly watched me bleed out at the bottom of a freezing ravine while he checked his expensive watch. I searched my heart for a shred of empathy, a tiny spark of familial love, but the well was completely, entirely dry. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical sense of closure. "You didn't panic, Christopher?" I said, my voice eerily calm and steady, devoid of any anger. Panic is a split-second, irrational decision made in the heat of the moment. You meticulously planned this execution for weeks. You researched and hired a criminal mechanic. You bribed a senior bank manager to bypass security. You stood on the edge of that foggy cliff. You checked your Rolex. And you made the calculated, conscious decision that my life was worth significantly less than your boutique gallery lease and your gambling debts. "I'm sorry," he sobbed uncontrollably, real tears finally streaming down his pale, terrified face. "I'll do anything. I'll sign over everything. Just please don't let them lock me away in there." "You aren't genuinely sorry that you did it, Christopher?" I replied, slowly standing up from the metal chair and looking down at him one last time. "You're just terrified and sorry that you made a fatal mistake. You left a witness." I didn't wait for his desperate response. I didn't need to hear another lie. I simply turned my back on him, walked straight out of the cold interrogation room, and let the heavy steel door slam loudly and decisively shut behind me. I didn't feel a single shred of guilt. I had spent my entire life silently paying for his mistakes, sacrificing my own happiness to keep his illusions alive, and the account was finally permanently closed. For the very first time since my car violently went over that cliff, the suffocating, heavy weight in my chest was completely gone. I walked out of the downtown police station and stepped out into the cool, crisp, deeply refreshing night air of the city. I looked up at the sky. The heavy Oregon fog had finally lifted, and I could see the stars. The justice system is often described as a slow, grinding machine. It took 11 exhausting months of legal maneuvering, endless depositions, and aggressive pre-trial hearings before we finally stepped foot inside the grand courtroom of the state superior court. But after living my entire life in the suffocating shadow of my family's expectations, 11 months felt like a brief moment in time. The courtroom was a massive, imposing space. It smelled heavily of lemon floor wax, old wood, and the nervous sweat of desperate people. I sat at the front bench, the hard mahogany pressing against my spine. My best friend Matthew sat firmly on my right side, his presence a silent wall of support. On my left was Elijah, our fiercely loyal lawyer, organizing his thick files. When the heavy side door opened and the bailiff escorted Christopher into the room, the entire gallery fell completely silent. It was genuinely shocking to see him, the golden child of our family, the man who used to command every room with his booming laugh and bespoke Italian suits, was entirely gone. Christopher looked completely broken. He was wearing an oversized, drab Orange County Jail uniform. His hair had thinned significantly, turning completely gray at the temples. His skin was pale and sallow from months of living under fluorescent lights without a glimpse of the sun. He looked 10 years older. He shuffled toward the defense table, his wrists restrained by heavy steel handcuffs chained to his waist. He didn't dare look in my direction. He kept his eyes glued firmly to the scuffed wooden floor. The trial itself was a methodical, absolute dismantling of my brother's life and lies. The prosecution called Julian, the junkyard mechanic, to the stand. Julian didn't hesitate to save his own skin. He played the secret audio recordings for the entire jury. The sound of Christopher's arrogant voice echoing through the courtroom, explicitly ordering Julian to cut my steering column and later demanding the car be crushed into a cube of scrap metal, sent a visible shudder through the 12 jurors. You could literally see the disgust washing over their faces. Then came Carter, the disgraced wealth manager. He wore a cheap suit, a far cry from his usual tailored attire. He admitted on the public record that Christopher had promised him a massive $2 million cut of our family inheritance. Carter detailed exactly how they planned to bypass the strict security protocols of the trust fund the very night my car went over the cliff. He confessed that Christopher was deeply underwater, facing dangerous threats over massive gambling debts, and that liquidating my life was his only remaining financial lifeline. Nurse Sarah took the stand next. She was the absolute picture of professional integrity. She testified about the 5 days I lay broken in the intensive care unit. She recounted the exact moment Christopher finally walked into the hospital lobby, not to visit his critically injured brother, but to casually toss my blood-stained wallet on the counter and leave without signing a single medical form. She painted a vivid, chilling picture of a man who viewed his brother's impending death as nothing more than a convenient administrative update. By the time the prosecution rested their case, Christopher's high-priced defense attorneys looked completely defeated. They had no counter-argument. They couldn't fight the laser-cut steel, the audio recordings, the forged trust documents, or the parade of witnesses. The evidence was an absolute mountain of undeniable guilt. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. It was a record for a case of this magnitude. When Judge Lincoln, a stern man with decades of experience on the bench, asked the jury foreman to read the verdict, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Guilty on the charge of attempted murder in the first degree. Guilty on the charge of criminal conspiracy. Guilty on the charge of massive financial fraud and grand larceny. Christopher physically collapsed back into his wooden chair, burying his face in his shackled hands. A loud, strangled sob escaped his throat. It was the first time in my entire life I had ever heard my brother cry genuine tears that weren't a manipulative performance. Judge Lincoln did not waste time. He looked down from the high bench, his eyes fixed firmly on Christopher with absolute contempt. "Christopher," Judge Lincoln's voice boomed through the quiet room. "In my 30 years on this bench, I have seen crimes of passion, and I have seen crimes of desperate poverty. But the absolute cold-blooded, calculated malice you displayed toward your own flesh and blood is uniquely disturbing. You were given every advantage in life. You had a golden childhood, a massive college fund, and the unwavering support of a brother who dedicated his life to preserving your family's legacy. And you repaid that loyalty by attempting to execute him for a payout. You viewed human life as an entirely disposable asset on your personal balance sheet." The judge paused, adjusting his reading glasses, before delivering the final blow. "I sentence you to 12 years in a maximum security state penitentiary. This sentence will be served without the possibility of parole for the first 7 years. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none to offer you today." The heavy wooden gavel slammed down. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. It was over. As the bailiffs aggressively pulled Christopher up from his chair to escort him to the transport van, he turned around. He looked directly across the courtroom aisle and locked eyes with me. He was searching for something. He was desperately searching for a tiny trace of the subservient younger brother who used to apologize for existing, the brother who would always step up to clean his messes and pay his debts. But he found absolutely nothing. I looked back at him with the cold, unyielding stare of a complete stranger. Walking out of the grand courthouse that afternoon was a surreal experience. The heavy, dark rain clouds that had covered the city all morning had finally broken. Bright, warm sunlight was streaming down onto the concrete steps. I took a deep breath of the fresh city air, and for the very first time in 32 years, my lungs felt completely clear. The heavy, invisible chain that had dragged me down since childhood was finally snapped. But I knew my journey wasn't entirely over. I still had to clean up the physical remnants of the past. A week later, I drove back to the sprawling Victorian mansion that had been our family's sanctuary for 3 generations. Walking through the heavy oak front doors, the house felt entirely different. It didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a massive, beautifully decorated tomb. Every single hallway, every grand chandelier, and every antique mirror held the heavy, toxic memories of a family dynamic built entirely on a foundation of emotional abuse and calculated neglect. This was the house where my parents had praised Christopher's every breath while treating my relentless hard work as an invisible, expected baseline. I walked into the grand library. The shelves were towering, filled with the $30 million collection of rare manuscripts our parents had spent their lives obsessively protecting. I had spent countless nights in this exact room, giving up my youth, my salary, and my personal freedom to meticulously catalog and preserve these books. I loved the history in this room, but I realized I was preserving a legacy for a family that never truly valued me. I made the difficult, deeply necessary decision to sell it all. I hired a highly reputable international auction house. Over the next 2 months, a team of professional archivists carefully packed up every single first edition journal, every rare historical document, and every leather-bound book. We moved the entire collection out of the house and shipped it to secure buyers across the globe. Watching those massive moving trucks pull out of the long gravel driveway was an incredibly emotional moment. A part of me grieved for the history, but a much larger part of me felt a profound, incredible sense of absolute relief. I was finally shedding the heavy armor of my parents' expectations. Next, I put the Victorian mansion on the aggressive real estate market. Because of its prime location and historical architecture, it sparked a bidding war. I sold the massive property for $15 million in cash to a wonderful young family with 3 energetic children. When I handed over the heavy brass keys to the new owners, I felt a deep sense of peace knowing the dark, quiet halls of that house would finally be filled with real laughter, running footsteps, and genuine warmth. I took the massive proceeds from the sale of the house, combined it with the remaining $15 million from the Family Inheritance Trust, and I made a decision that would define the second half of my life. I did not want to hoard the wealth. I did not want to become a paranoid, miserable guardian of a bank account like my parents had been. I wanted the money to actually mean something. I sat down with Elijah in his downtown law office and signed the vast majority of the family wealth over to establish a brand new charitable organization. We named it the Pacific Lighthouse Foundation. I designed the foundation's core mission to provide aggressive, top-tier legal representation, secure emergency housing, and immediate financial grants to victims of severe domestic sabotage and familial financial abuse. I wanted to help the people who felt completely trapped, the people who were drowning in the heavy fog of their own toxic families. I wanted to be the bright, guiding light that Aaron the truck driver had been for me when I was bleeding out at the bottom of that dark ravine. For the absolute first time in my entire life, I felt a profound sense of genuine purpose. I wasn't building a legacy for a ghost. I was building a future for survivors. My new life looks entirely different from the old one. I did not buy another massive mansion or surround myself with antique, heavy furniture that reminded me of the past. I bought a sleek, modern, incredibly bright apartment on the very top floor of a high-rise building overlooking the serene, open waters of the Pacific Ocean. The walls are painted stark white, the windows are massive floor-to-ceiling glass panels, and the space is completely filled with natural sunlight. There are no dark corners. There are no heavy shadows for secrets to hide in. I spend my days actively managing the foundation. I meet with survivors, I coordinate with law enforcement, and I oversee the distribution of emergency funds. Every single time we help a person break free from a toxic family dynamic, every time we secure a safe home for someone who was financially drained by their own relatives, I feel a piece of my own trauma heal. I built a beautiful, chosen family around me. Matthew and his wife come over for dinner every Sunday. Elijah stops by for coffee during the week. I am surrounded by people who respect me for exactly who I am, not for the resources they can extract from me. But the past has a funny way of occasionally trying to knock on your door, just to see if the locks still hold. It happened on a quiet, rainy Tuesday afternoon. I had just returned home from the foundation office. I walked down to the lobby of my building to check my metal mailbox. Mixed in with the standard utility bills and local glossy magazines was a plain, cheap white envelope. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was a messy, looping script that I had seen on countless bounce checks and forged documents. I looked at the top left corner of the envelope. It bore the distinct, heavy black ink stamp of the state maximum security correctional facility. It was from Christopher. He had been sitting in a concrete cell for exactly 2 years. I carried the stack of mail up to my apartment, walked into my living room, and stood perfectly still in front of the modern gas fireplace. I held the cheap white envelope in my hands for a very long time. I traced my thumb over the rough paper. A tiny, distant part of my brain, the leftover remnants of the traumatized younger brother, wondered what was written on the lined paper inside. Was it finally a genuine, profound apology? Had the harsh reality of prison stripped away his massive ego and forced him to truly face the monster he had become? Or was it just another desperate, highly manipulative attempt to find a new angle? Was he going to blame our parents, blame the bookies, or blame the universe for his terrible choices? Was he going to beg me for money to put into his prison commissary account? As I stood there watching the orange flames dance in the fireplace, a wave of absolute, crystal-clear realization washed over me. It simply didn't matter what the letter said. If it was an apology, I didn't need it to find my own peace. If it was a manipulation, I wasn't going to let that toxic poison back into the beautiful, clean life I had worked so incredibly hard to rebuild. Reading his words, giving him even 5 minutes of my mental energy, would be a massive step backward. It would be inviting the ghost back into the house. I didn't open the envelope. I didn't tear the seal. With a completely steady hand and a calm heart, I tossed the sealed white envelope directly into the center of the dancing orange flames. I stood there and watched the fire quickly consume the paper. It curled, blackened, and turned to fragile gray ash before floating up the chimney. It was the ultimate, physical symbol of the final severance of the heavy bond that had almost killed me. The last remaining chain was completely broken. I walked over to the massive glass window and looked out at the vast, endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The rain had stopped, and the setting sun was painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and deep purple. I have come to realize something profound over the last few years. For 32 years, I had been the silent, dedicated investor in a version of a family that never actually existed. I was sacrificing my soul to maintain an illusion of harmony, pouring my energy into a bottomless well of entitlement. If you are listening to my story today, and you have ever felt like the ultimate outsider, the scapegoat, or the spare part in your own family, I need to look you in the eye and tell you something incredibly important. You are not crazy. You are not defective. You are highly likely just too independent, too empathetic, and too intensely real for a family unit that strictly prioritized the fake performance of harmony over the reality of unconditional love. The deep, aching pain of not belonging to the people who are supposed to love you the most is a heavy, suffocating shroud. But you absolutely do not have to wear it forever. You can take it off. True, lasting strength is not always found in endless forgiveness, especially when the other party is completely unrepentant and continues to cause you harm. True strength is found in the absolute, unshakable decisiveness to cut toxic ties, to lock the door, and to aggressively protect your own future and your own peace of mind. Society tells us that blood is thicker than water, but sometimes, blood is just toxic. Forgiveness is not a mandatory gift you must hand to your abuser to be a good person. Sometimes, the most loving, respectful thing you can possibly do for yourself is to close the heavy door firmly on the dark past, walk away without looking back, and step into the genuine warmth of your own sun. You deserve to be deeply seen as a human being, not utilized as a convenient resource. Thank you for walking this incredibly difficult journey with me to the very end. The lessons I learned at the absolute bottom of that foggy ravine changed the entire trajectory of my life. I learned that you cannot heal in the exact same environment that made you sick, and you cannot save someone who is actively trying to drown you to stay afloat. I want to know what you think. What is the one lesson from this story that resonates the most with your own life? Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to save yourself? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, or simply type the word "good," so I know that you value the hard lessons this journey brought to light. Your engagement helps this story reach the people who might be sitting in the dark right now, needing the courage to finally walk away. Stay strong, protect your peace, And never let anyone make you the ghost in your own life.